You know, there's a saying that goes around that there's only a matter of time before you do exactly the opposite of what you said earlier in your life. Well, today is exactly that day when I thought it was finally time to talk about that one movie nobody should talk about, where the issue of me talking about it should not stem from its real-world divisiveness, but a world of movies that exist for no reason other than the profit off of its connection to the past to fund its present. And yeah, we're obviously talking about Snow White, the darling of everything good and everything bad about Disney from its humble beginnings to its careless endings. It's something I want to make now because of the fact I didn't want to make it, which I'm sure is making some of you confused right about now. Because why would I waste time talking about a movie months ago that I declared I didn't want to watch when it came out, when all of the evidence pointed out that the abysmal truth that it wasn't going to succeed by any metric both inside and out? Well, the answer is actually simple, and it's because I love Disney. The fact that everyone knows that drives most of this channel. And when I say something as confusing as that, I just say that honestly because most times it is easier to be on the other side hating everything that they do, and I completely understand that. Also accepting my own fate and opinions despite everything bad, I disagree with them as much as those who hate it completely. Where there's just an infallible truth that the love of this organization comes from the passion of one man who wanted to do more to bring us together, to at least look back on the good reasons we should watch these fantasy films compared to a darker, dreary world and see what others can do to create out of it. And when you see something like Snow White, you see the decisions of disrespect, which is the antithesis of its own work, be it from converting its animation to live action or creating a story that deviates greatly from its intended purposes. It marks the culmination of all the wrong lessons learned into making at this time, where people cannot be any more divided on their passionate stupidity regarding any subject. The part where society either becomes ignorant to what the past lesson was really about or defends the old by attacking all the new based on full-out hatred. And that's a statement that really prevented me from even talking or thinking about doing this video, all because of the attention that was literally dragged onto this one film, more than any other Disney live-action remake, where nobody came out as clear winners for the events in this movie and in our own real world politically. Cause I don't think any other movie that Disney has produced has ever conjured up so many controversies unlike this one, for something that can be completely understandable. After all, we are talking about a film that was the first full-length featured animation picture ever created that changed the realms of movies for what we know today. So of course it's going to get scrutinized for taking a bite out of that as time progressed them to dilute their own brand of remakes. It's something you really can't easily do just like their past films because of it being the oldest of all of their films. The first real starting point where any deviation from the picture is seen as a failure regarding all of their modern changes to a fantasy-based setting, where compared to that, you can at least live with knowing it's a lesser version. Whereas with this, whatever you say about it, it seems more like an attack on its own legacy, including the shortening of the title and removing of the 7 dwarves, which is the main source of criticism many of us had about this movie before they ended up as CGI abominations. But moving on to what the real world consequences are, is the main actors of Rachel Zegler and Gal Gadot, where everyone could not stop talking about Rachel since she stupidly made the wrong comments about the original film in today's polarized climate. Just a way where it doesn't feel respectful or understanding about what it could have been done to further understand why the original was done the way it was for a new venture, which many outlets already suggested she was not doing the film any favors by stating this compared to many of our other remake counterparts that actually celebrated and respected the originals in various forms. A hand that only got worse when the real world started to seep in more and more with the conversation of woke and anti-woke in society. That coupled with her and Gadot's own opposing views on Israel and Palestine that just made things much more worse for people on either side that wanted to boycott this film, and also the aftermath of 2024 to put things lightly. But I'll just leave those parts as is of the real world on that, as I have no intention nor the utmost knowledge to even talk about these subjects because that is not what I come for. And of course, I don't intend to make this like any other channel that pumped out 10 million videos on Rachel being a brat or having different views than mine, but on an informative understanding of the film we seek to recreate. Because the fact still remains, she is literally the best part of the film, for someone who literally outside of that became the worst part to bash for it. Again, that's why I just waited this long, because I wasn't going to buy into that. I wasn't going to be part of any conversation where it was milking off dumb comments and political strife, since that was what was recommended. Preaching the death of Disney like you always do, or something of that nature when they will not. They will fall as I have covered, but there certainly is always something better who can pick up the pace, and I will stand by those people who make the great content. But I also will not stand for terrible stories and replacing dwarves into non-existence with animated counterparts that even even the original is more realistic than that. And so I will just seek to cover this mistake and turn the tide back to realize what is more important. Because there's also the same truth that they cannot stop doing these films. And they won't stop if films like Lilo and Stitch released only 2 months later made $1 billion that more people seem content by. Sure, it also has its problems like any other remake, but at least many people seemed way more satisfied to see a cute fluffy character hanging out with some locals that respected most of its original compared to a not so Snow White and the 7 Abominations of Hell. Like, whatever happened to that same studio? The live action one that produced films like Cinderella, The Jungle Book, and even the Beauty and the Beast remake. How did this one manage to dig itself into a huge grave that even Disney felt like abandoning during the final stages of release? We may never know those details other than modern attitudes and monetary gain, where it's just best that they get back to it. Otherwise, they'd be facing another net loss, as this film only made $206 million for a bloated budget between $240 and $270 million, meaning that this film is a big financial failure for them. Where its impact is also felt where the live action Tangled was halted indefinitely, and more recently the Aristocats live action remake that was in production was not moving forward in August of 2025. 2 films canned as a result of films like this, where simply this was just the worst decision that Disney has ever made currently that has caused them to rethink things for the foreseeable future. It doesn't mean they'll stop, since I just pointed out that they made bank with Stitch and already announced its sequel and still have others like Moana to fall back on, but it's a simple truth that they cannot afford to reuse their movies like a broken pencil. And so my goal with this video is just to simply demonstrate the beauty of what the original intended for its time, comparing that to a movie that tries to make it more than what it needs to be, just like all the others, in a much more worse way, to see the good of it all, but mainly the bad results. And I won't be doing a completely thorough analysis on this either, because that's just not worth it. So the point can be just short and sweet. Emphasis on the sweet, because we don't need to go down the wrong path, unlike some people reading articles and taking them out of context. So without further ado, let's begin in the world of Snow White. When we look how they introduce the beginning of the film, you see it's like you're actually stepping into the pages of a book. Literally during Walt's time, they would just have these live action footage of them opening a book like you were reading a fairy tale, where you just have to keep that fact in mind, because that's what the entire goal of that movie was. The look and feel of the Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs story and its characters just evokes a fairy tale book coming to life, and that's the thing you always need to remember when you realize the simplicity of its storytelling, being a little bit basic or short, being no more or no less than what needs to be shown. Like, here's this fantasy kingdom ruled by this queen who cares much about her looks and control over everything, making her own stepdaughter Snow White work as a scullery maid who simply dreams over her wishes someday coming true, like a prince or other things that a fair maiden would want. Where technically the remake also tries to begin just as that, but with the difference that everything in the scene is now CGI now, because, you know, with the animals and of course the removal of the 7 Dwarfs in the title to make it clear what kind of movie this is. Where again, we just have to remember that the main reason for this choice is not because they hate the dwarves, they probably do, but because they want the film to sell. That the reason can be actually justified to shorter names to differentiate the two instead of adding a longer title to it with Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, thinking it'd be better so you know which movie this is, or just because they don't want that elongated nature for a title anymore, even though this movie is elongated on so many levels. Where this new adaptation decides to start things off with Snow White's actual parents, the king and queen, focusing on Snow White's childhood and the rise of the evil queen herself. And this is the hallmark of any Disney remake for the most part, or the best of what they try to do in the fantasy setting, to have their golden and silver age films explain the backstory that wasn't there before, which isn't necessarily a bad thing at all, and actually are a net positive, because like I said, the original animated films acts as books coming to life, and the art matches up where you could just dive right into the world and see it unfold as those worlds are being spoken into reality, not really being narrated in the sense like this film is being done, but in the sense that the words are actually reality that you see right in front of you. For that, I would also like to bring up Cinderella 2015 a lot into this, because the path that this film is necessarily taking is somewhat similar to what happened in that with the youth of both Snow White and Cinderella, with their parents before they died. It's not remotely the same thing as they are different characters being royals or wealthy family, but in the same build up to the point that they are against the villain. Like, literally, that's what you can tell when they're both happy families and their main message in both parents is to be courageous and kind, having hope of any type. But the big true difference here is the fact that Snow White is a full-on musical, and it has more songs than even some Renaissance films, and of course more than the original Snow White itself, where they do say it's a musical fantasy film for the original, but compared to the work starting out with The Little Mermaid, it does seem a bit small or controlled, only necessary when the biggest points want to be made, like Someday My Prince Will Come, Whistle While You Work, Hi-Ho, and just all the other classic fairy tale melodies that you take in a lovely world, and it doesn't need much more than that. Just like what happens in Cinderella, which didn't even use its main songs at all and focused on the story, and just a smaller lullaby at the end while the credits use those originals. The point is just to be simply made here is that the film has too many songs, as we will get to see, and most of them are not good to my own taste. Because what you're about to see me explain later on is that when you think you get a break from a song, they still continue on in some form. And I really don't like that at all. It's more than what needs to be said. So anyways, the first act actually consists of how she was named Snow White, simply born with the name because it was snowing outside. Like, wow, really clever, just name all the other times Disney explained how people's names were gotten to be just like that. Just like how Cinderella was named because Ella got cinders on her face one time. Another nonsensical win for a live action remake which goes along explaining what they do in the kingdom to be kind and fair as can be for its main song. You know, the fair part because fairest of them all, right? And I'm not really going to talk too much about these songs since I expressed my distaste about them and more about what they do for them instead when this part ends, where the narrator reveals later on that the queen passed away, not an on-screen death but rippling away from their lives from the well. Again, this is another point that is very similar in the case of Cinderella, yet lesser than that version because Ella had to see her mother actually die on her deathbed before imbuing the important lesson and themes that she would carry on in her life, in the way that the film does to respect its original by adding this important detail, compared to a film that just goes off in so many different tangents and tones with songs and whatnot. Like, think of the way that this film presents itself as, the setup to each other, and you see that only one actually does this right because although it's a short sequence for the entire event, it imprints something important on the character that would inform them to their finale when all is said and done. Just rippling her out really doesn't actually help when you know they have a personal relationship, just like the one you see later on with Evil Queen, who first comes in and makes the king fall in love with him. Also similar to when Ella gave her dad a second chance with Lady Tremaine, the same villains coming out together and stealing their lives away, making it again much more similar to that film but on a lesser scale. Except for the fact that the Evil Queen, unlike Lady Tremaine, practices witchcraft that we all know since she boldly declared that she's evil compared to what has happened in Cinderella. Instead of him dying of natural causes, she sends him out under the guise of battling enemy forces, secretly killing him off so she can take over and begin her despotic rule, raising Snow White as that scullery maid we know of while also cutting her hair off to the style we know best, cause you know, that's just how it happened. So regarding this whole opening act, we can actually give them credit for establishing a base to how Snow White came to be in the beginning on the lore of her family, and also the relationship between the Evil Queen and the time. Yet, however, also show that it's not the best way that could have been done regarding past stories and their over-incessant need to songify it, if you get what I mean. This film is taking the bad lessons of past remakes since they established themselves as musicals while also trying to put the good of where they can start, and it just really doesn't work because of that original basis again. It's just a story that can't be like that, and it's all just led up so we could get to the point to lead us to Rachel Snow. Where finally, with her main character now fully grown up, is where we can actually start comparing films again, since it deviates well away from each other in so many ways. With of course Snow White singing and working with the animals by the well compared to just working around the grounds to meet the newer version of the prince, who's not a prince, but actually might as well be a prince if he marries Snow White at the end, named Jonathan. A new character in a long line of Disney replacements, where old characters aren't simply good enough for a remake, but end up being almost similar to their original counterparts with a move that is just so unnecessary it defeats the purpose of what they removed. Just naming somebody else different if you remember others like Mulan and Shang. It just doesn't make sense, but it fits a narrative of modern times dialogue. But this one can excuse itself to be much more different than just a prince, because Jonathan is a commoner rebel. He dislikes the reign of the queen and does anything to fight back for the people when he meets Snow White for the first time before getting arrested. You know, instead of the prince just showing up because he has a beautiful voice and dreams of her prince finally coming because, you know, that's just too unrealistic, right? I mean, I really can't criticize the direction they want to do with this, that is much in comparison to the old film, but more towards the reaction outside of that Rachel didn't do a good job in handling. Not being saved by the prince, which, spoiler, she actually does kinda get saved by Jonathan to wake up, and all the other nonsense that disrespects her own original wishes because it was just too basic. Because the point of that was just being something short and sweet to the public at the time who did not even think that films like this were even possible till Walt brought up the idea, choosing something like this that could be simple enough that anyone could enjoy, and still holds up well over 88 years later, which that 88-year film only takes 10 minutes to get her to the force compared to a film in 2025 that takes 20 minutes because of exposition, when Snow tries to talk to the queen who doesn't give two shits nor can act for shit to care about what's going on. And side note here, when they made the original and you see its runtime, the story does move at a quick pace, and that's very intentional, both in terms of how it's the first film of its type and using what is only necessary to move the plot forward, with Walt himself wanting to remove anything that didn't move the story along, setting a basis of what needed to be shown in a shorter amount of time, where you understand everything about them without much more to it, unlike how some people in this film do not understand anything, but they don't care because it's a point to cause her to sing the ultimate I Want song of the film, Waiting on a Wish. And most of these film songs were written by the same guys who brought the new Aladdin songs before, the ones I do not like at all because of how out of tune it was to the original soundtrack for some damn reason, hence why I really don't even like this one, even though again her I Want song is kind of okay, but still not good enough to make me care about it more than I'm Wishing ever did, that is still recognized by many Disney fans today. More people sing that song than whatever Waiting on a Wish is. People just simply don't care about a song from a film that simply didn't even make back its budget at all. Anyways, this song is the encouraging standpoint for her to do something against the queen by freeing Jonathan and giving him bread to do anything that could be useful, which is also the moment that we finally get back to the very beginning of the original film, where she goes to meet the magic mirror on the wall and proclaim who is the fairest of them all, where the key word here is the fairest, since they play this part after the part where she freed him, because it's all about being fair. Not a fair maiden if you get my drift, but a fair individual. Instead of the beginning where she gets jealous because she's proclaimed as such and then the events begin as is because she wants the huntsman to go out and kill her while they're out. Well, originally it was just going to have the huntsman kill her in secret when he finally gets to stab her, which of course he can't, and one where she actually questions why is he doing this, compared to the original pure shock of Snow White seeing that the huntsman was trying to kill her in the first place, where one of the greater things about the classic film is her expressions. You know, at a time when animation wasn't really even done for movies, it was the first that many would see, and the way they did it was truly impressive and showcases the fear in her eyes as well from this threat that she doesn't understand, this entire bubbly worldview that she has being contrasted with the dark forces of nature behind her back. This one is more lame, provided only by the tension to know if he does the right thing or not, exposing the truth that he knows what happened to her father before begging her to run off into the woods before he has no choice but to actually kill her. Like, it works greatly to put the fear into her of what she would do, even if this newer version is better off having both the queen and Snow interact, which is something that never really happened outside of her old hag appearance giving the apple to explore more the context of what she does. And I will also give them credit for following that sort of same events that happen when she runs through the dark forest with the bats and the owls and the big trees, but how they ended early for some joke twist that the animals were watching over her, because the original has her fall down next to the water before all the trees' eyes stare at her, causing her to faint, which in turn was actually the animal's eyes watching over her like this, but how it's more effective in the animated sense due to her fears while running away. The focus on herself, where her mind is focused on what's coming after her, and it's making her filled with dread with the iconic shots on her face, which is something you can never see this film even do, and immediately go with the fact that it was just the forest animals looking at her, and then coming to her and calming her down. different from how you say them initially frightened by her touch before she calms them down by talking to them like she did with the birds at the beginning, which actually formed the stereotypical image that the princess talks to animals, which is also the point where she starts to begin to sing in her high-pitched voice that Rachel cannot do at all, which is another point to talk about in the features of Snow White, as how her voice is so iconic to her character. Again, while I do say Rachel is standout for her performance in this film unlike others, she just doesn't match what the original Snow White sounds like. Of course, not that I would even think for a project of this type that they would even have that attempt to go that way, since it's being more realistic, and having that voice would not work. But in the sense of the original, Adriana Castellotti's voice is the pinnacle of what all princesses would be inspired by with her high voice, a direction that Walt Disney went for from the start, not wanting a mature voice to have. In fact, in an interview, he stated when finding the voice for Snow White, he wanted to get a voice for Snow White that would be kind of away from the everyday, you know, kind of off in another world, something that perfectly fits for a fairy tale and doesn't remind you of anything that exists currently in any form, and that's why her voice is like that.
I found a voice. I wanted to get a voice for Snow White. It would be kind of away from everyday, you know, kind of off in another world. I want someone who can sing too, because we're going to use a lot of songs. And I was hunting for a certain quality voice. So I had one of the boys searching for voices. He went everywhere. So he kept bringing these people in. Now, I didn't want to be thrown by looking at the person because I only wanted their voice. So the sound stage was right next to my office. We had a microphone there. And in my office, I had a big speaker. Now, I'd be working all around the studio, and I'd get a call from him. He had a voice. He wanted me to hear it. Now, the person who was coming in to audition didn't know that I was listening. They were doing a little test in a microphone. That let them relax. He'd call me, I'd leave whatever meeting I was in, I'd come into my office, turn on my speaker, and then this voice would come. And he'd pick up the phone and say, "What do you think?" So we kept hunting for voices. Every day there'd be 2 or 3 coming in I'd listen to. One day he called me all excited. He says, "I have a 14-year-old girl." He says, "She has a terrific voice." And I says, "Oh, we can put her on right away." I said, "Put her on." I dashed in and I listened, but it sounded like someone around 30. Between 20 and 30. He called, he says, "What do you think?" I says, "No, she sounds too old, too mature." I said, "I got to get something that's thinner, something that seems younger." "Too mature." He says, "Well, she's good, isn't she?" "Yes, but I said she sounds too old." So I turned her down. That was Dina Durbin. One day he come in with a voice and I listened to it. I said, "That's perfect." I said, "She sounds to me like a 14-year-old girl." He said, "Well, she's 18, you know." But it was it. It was a little girl called Adriana Castellotti. And she came from an opera family, but she had that training, you know. She could do all this beautiful bird-like stuff. So I signed her.
It's charming, wonderful, and magical for the type of qualities you search for in a storybook, and it completely fits. And you're just completely normal and sanitized when it comes to Rachel Zegler, or just any other person who they chose, because using that quality of voice is just borderline parody, which technically this film is when you see what happens to the other scenes. So again, she finds the dwarf's cottage as normal, wanting to see if anyone's there where she and animals enter, but what the difference is, they just leave one major song out for the moment when she finally goes to sleep. I say this because we're talking about Whistle While You Work, the merry tune she sings while cleaning the house with the animals, where the remake decides to not actually feature her yet and go to bed, because why not, and how they put it in later when the dwarfs are actually finally introduced, maybe just for more context of spending time with them or something else, which again defeats the pacing of the original for newer features of this film with songs or different scenes. Like, you have stuff you know, but then they mix it around like it's okay because of the pacing of the story, and I really don't like that because the way they did it was again to inform the audience of Snow White's character with the animals, advocating for cleanliness or other attitudes of herself to understand her better in a much more basic form, rather than exposition, since we still need to fight the evil queen, and that's why we need to move a song in a different direction while adding a new one in between. Because next up is of course the intro of the dwarves themselves, or as we like to call them, the abominations, because they just still don't look right no matter what you say. In what way do you justify this after everything that went behind the scenes or what was publicly spoken that stemmed all the way back because Peter Dinklage side spoke about it as a backward story, which it clearly wasn't, and made them co-protagonists of the story in the title itself. We realize today that they are good characters that are big parts of Disney's lineup that are featured in parks and other stuff at this moment. Like, that is ridiculous just to not feature them. To actually have those with dwarfism represented in a positive role with just some makeup would really showcase a realistic version of those animated characters instead of something that doesn't look remotely real at all. Because if you look back on the original, their design drawings are quite impressive for 1937, timeless and beautiful, dare I say, for their individual faces to match their attitudes, where the power of a drawing can create its own believable reality that we can accept, rather than this that tries to emulate that feeling with no success at all done through a computer. Again, they also try to be different by immediately starting hi-ho before they work rather than beginning with them already in the mine working to dig before they sing the chorus hi-ho, being the call that work is done for the day and go home, rather than the beginning because they just want to extend the lyrics for the scene with the funny clumsy dwarfs. Just this weird necessity to play in out of order sometimes, like them walking to work with their shadows and then expanding the mines where they have this glowing powers to light up the area if that was a fact that needed to be learned, because yeah, or even just turning it into a roller coaster down the mines like this is the Seven Dwarfs mine train at Disney World, since you gotta have your movie to be fun too, there's just zipping and riding around the entire mine just like that. They just put a lot of unnecessary bullshit in scenes like this just because it's a 21st century film, loving if this is the way to appeal to people when clearly it's not, failing everyone in the process for something simple where the dwarves were just digging in the mines and looking for diamonds. It's really amazing how mostly still background images and paintings with animated dwarves walking is just more iconic than any other shot that this film has to do with its wacky action. Truly amazing how far you can fall with that. Anyways, let's just skip to the part where Snow White wakes up to the doors, that we initially go through a sequence where they try to sneak up to find this intruder compared to them immediately seeing the blankets to move where they leave Dopey to that very wolves. Also a big difference is how they show their pajamas in this new version if you wanted to know how they go to sleep in their jammies. But the main part of having this here is how Dopey is the one that makes a connection with Snow White that plays a greater role, not really, into what happens at the very end. Whereas when the classic was them all together, shocked at the appearance of Snow White, which they almost killed themselves, and how they're infatuated by her beauty, of course. In the remake, it's revealed that they are over 274 years old apparently, as if that was important to know, and have not seen much humans activity or heard from the king in a while as he searches for and needs their help considering the queen. They agree to let her stay for now in order to hide from the queen, while the scene turns back towards the castle and the truth of how she was not killed. And instead of being angry that she got tricked with the heart of a pig, is where she actually goes into song to arrest the huntsman. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like a good villain song, but just not this one. Not at all. It's just as bad as her singing in that Slaughter Race song from Ralph Breaks the Internet, where it's nothing about it is actually entertaining. In no form did we ever need the evil queen to have a song at all. It just doesn't fit for this era of Disney villains or films when they didn't actually have any. Maleficent didn't have any in Sleeping Beauty or her own films that were remade later on, and neither did Lady Tremaine if we compared Cinderella back to this again, where simply you just need an effective threat to tell your story and not some sassy evil queen torturing a poor fool to sing him that he's going to get punished for his actions and that she's selfish with her beauty. This is the part where you have to call it a parody because it just basically feels just like that, with a film that has 10 million songs about every important action they take for a film that's only like 20 minutes longer excluding all the credits. They blur the lines between what should be done and what should never have been done together and want us to accept it as is, and it still doesn't quite work. Her character just doesn't work other than to have the face of Gal Gadot putting on the beauty of the original one, where the attitude is more strict and cold rather than mischievous and greedy, sprinkled in with some sass. Again, Walt only included what was necessary to carry information forward, and the best way possible was just delivered later in the film when she makes her transformation to do something about it. Not waste time in the middle for her to sing a song before going back to the main characters. A constant motion of going back and forth when they didn't even need to do that because the focus was on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and sometimes the queen who wants to take that away. But this switchback is for them to obviously be the part where she finally sings Whistle While You Work just because, to move from one song to the next so she can fix the doors to be more helpful or something like that. They really just want to explain all the things through song, and that's the only way people could be entertained by such a relatively basic story otherwise. It's put here because it's more about cleaning up their behavior around here, similar to how she demanded them to wash their hands for the first time before making dinner since they treated her so well. This is another point to realize why it's called And the Seven Dwarfs compared to the remake, since a lot of the film has them hanging out together, rather than Snow White's tangents of her hanging out with Jonathan and his eventual crew, because of course, she now asks them for help to find her father to restore the kingdom and needs the bandits' help as a course of action, something described by Doc in great detail since he has smart intelligence.
Those rebels are nothing but thieves.
They're actually a band of erstwhile actors whose sustenance was made unstable by the Queen's greedy economic policies, which forced them into a liminal space where ethics and motives are ill-defined.
You know, I bet Walt Disney was thinking back in 1937 that one day my film will eventually get remade, have hideous-looking dwarves where their leader will talk about how people became bandits under my first villain due to her economic policies and forced into liminal spaces. Like, really? We're talking about economics and liminal spaces in this movie? In what world does this dialogue seems befitting for a family movie? Because I beg of you to go back in most of Disney's movies, their feature animation, and see one time where they talk about a royal's economic policies, since it simply does not exist. And you might say, hey, you know that seems kinda small and a minor inconvenience, but no, I'm just standing up for a fairy tale story and not an expose or a revolution to why the queen is bad for business when she's singing songs herself too. I just don't think that writing that down is necessary at all for any character, like her necessarily talking to Jonathan later after all of this. Once again, leading to yet another song where they talk about princess problems. And in no less than 20 minutes of this film, do we get to be subjected to one song after the next, like I just said at the beginning. The most you could see in any Disney film that has even existed, and I really hate it. Like from the very first scene when we get to hang out with her, to her family with the current moment in time, it's just nothing but singing with 5 minutes of talking in between. It's just literally mad, and it dilutes the whole point of having these musical films in the first place, because when they made the songs, they only made them fit logically within the flow of information that the story tells that connects to its main theme. At most, in the Disney Renaissance especially, they had like 5 to 7 songs, including their reprises, but for some reason, this film has to feature 15 songs. 4 from the original, with all the other new ones like these ones and the reprises. It's adding in between what we already had and adding even more to sell some weird fantasy of problems that these people have. I know this might seem like I'm repeating something I said earlier, but the more you progress in this film, the more you have to question it, because if Cinderella didn't even need to use a single song at all except for that lavender blue dilly dilly to tell its story, then why should this one feel the need to do anything but all songs? You don't need a big musical number every 5 minutes, because simply just slowing down to talk gives us the same info that we already would have known in those big moments. It has to build towards it instead of refurbishing it, as I would like to say this act is doing. Plus, this song just decides to abruptly stop so we can meet the bandits who Jonathan leads, which leads to a very interesting point of what these bandits represent, with 7 of them including Jonathan there, which shows that the old photo many people made a controversy out of during production, making people believe they were the dwarf stand-ins, were actually separate people for some weird reason, where their inclusion in this film alongside the dwarves themselves is just borderline unnecessary, just like a lot of this film anyway. Other than what they're doing right now to fight the guards, they don't really do much in this film other than appear for the sake of people against the queen. They just show up as like background extras at the very most with lines, wanting to have these people to showcase that the people think that the queen is an evil tyrant rather than focusing on the storybook nature of her own pettiness. And another thing to point out here about the bandits is that one of them named Quig has dwarfism. Again, going back to Peter Dinklage's point that made Disney consult with them and rethink this just to have them as big-headed monsters instead of casting them as live-action dwarfs anyway. Just deciding now to separate the distinction like that, and it's just very upsetting. Not for the fact he's included in any way, it's great to have him, but we could have had him and real depictions of dwarves with costumes and makeup for that positive role that they all filled. But of course, we just couldn't have had that. We can't have these roles be casted by people who would have loved to play them, because that is just wrong, and it creates moral outrage that infects society to make the wrong choices or think the wrong things that no one will be able to win with. So instead here, we just make up these 7 people to mitigate some fear when it turns out they serve no greater purpose to its story. And I don't really need to talk about the fight scene when Jonathan gets injured or trying to save Snow White when they go back to the cottage to have him fixed up magically like it was nothing at all, trying to do this small fake out that maybe he cannot be saved until he finally gets saved because the original story demands it, because he serves as the prince's role. Oh yeah, and I can't forget that the story just loves to use comedy in a Marvelized fashion too, because Disney cannot go without it in all of their live action, including bangers like this one.
My name's Jonathan, Princess. Not Jonathan, Princess. Just Jonathan.
Who wrote this shit? Honestly, these lines are just a greater crime than any dialogue, and it's not even close. Not even close to doing the most stupid things like their awkward relationship or making this silly song sound more country to my ears. It's a much more shortened version of that original because of course it goes on to back another song professing Jonathan and Snow White's love for each other once more by doing that ridiculous thing of adding too much songs next to each other. Noticing that this is how we take random tangents outside of the original where we do one thing and then go back as soon as we get to the dwarf songs when she was hanging out with them and dancing with them, not even having the charm of them doing what they did here, building up to dance with Snow White or anything else. Which, you really got to appreciate the animators for capturing the live action to make it so real. It's so fluid for the first of its type, and that's very much appreciated to this day. What's not appreciated, however, is the constant barrage of musical numbers or slow love songs that never needed to be included just for everyone to stare at them before they have to leave, where Jonathan gets captured and imprisoned by the queen, who figures out where Snow White is staying and does another shitty reprise of her song set in her transformation. That should have happened like 20 minutes earlier and then continuation with the revelation scene. It's incredible to realize that it took them this long to even do it, and the fact that the original was just straight to the point. No unnecessary bullshit or information that makes you deduce what they want in the moment from their enemy, where she immediately wants to take action to do it herself. And although it's very hideous to see her transformation, that discusses mainly how the bad computer effects for her between the makeup and the original face compared to the darkness of the animated transformation where she reveals her true hideous nature that clearly hurts, you know, compared to belting out singing down the stairs. I mean, how do you honestly screw that up thinking she just transformed like that? The effect that they were aiming for was giving up her own supposed beauty for an appearance of an ugly hag that hurt her to even do so, and turning her into her own true inner demon, evil and greedy as hell. Like the eyes, the costume, everything about this makes it 10 times more a compelling threat, and I'm not sure why they can't even understand that, or why Snow White took this long to leave the cottage before the evil queen shows up to give her the iconic apple. We know originally that it was just the old lady being kind to her to give apples for a pie that she was probably baking. Having a bite, dearie, where now it's about her disguising as someone who knows Jonathan using the necklace that she gave, which leads her to try and search for him because she knows she loves him, but not without her help to take the apple. To which I really have to say that this is a much more stupider plan than I realized, because this version of Snow White is smart enough to go out there, but the queen is just insistent on giving her the apple for that journey because she knew her father gave back to the people. Again, the old peddler version of the queen in the original took advantage of Snow White's kindness and passion for cooking, trying to give an apple to see how it tastes, you know, just a simple offering. And now it's just, you take this apple for your father and you eat it. You eat it on your journey just to see him. You eat it to honor your father, dearie. You do that. Just like that, and no questions asked of actually taking it and running off, because somehow that's just even better than just giving a taste of an apple to a person who wants to make apple pies or something else. It's like they just don't understand Snow White at all, never really even watched it in the first place. But they just don't care about that fact when they can just have her gloat when it's revealed to Snow herself that it was the evil queen and she did indeed kill her father for the goodness and taking over her kingdom, falling in a sleep-like death just as before, winning while oppressing everyone else once more as she escaped faster this time compared to when the dwarves finally caught up to her and killed her in the process. The reason for this of course stems from the fact that they mourn over her until her prince comes and they live happily ever after, and in a film like that where they cannot do that at all out of agency of adding new steps to sympathize with our protagonist, with Jonathan trying to do his best to get out of jail and find her, which he does successfully and finds himself in a position similar to the original with a much more sadder tone to mourn her loss. And to do that, of course, he has to say a sad goodbye kiss, which conveniently enough actually awakes her. And by now, you're probably thinking, what was that Rachel said originally what was going to happen? Oh yeah, she said she wasn't going to get saved by the prince, right? Well, unfortunately, she's actually both right and wrong from this film. Only for the fact that they made Jonathan not the prince anymore, but still a similar character who actually does save her from her permanent slumber. She literally just has been saved from that right on here, thus making everything she said was moot and probably so stupid to bring up originally, since that was the only way this film could have proceeded as is, where the only saving grace from that statement is that the fact that this is not the happy ending yet, since she wants to get the queen who still is alive for her to face, you know, compared to her just dying off the cliff because of her own hubris at her peak only to fall. the perfect death out of consequence of her own actions, where she stayed as is, truly was, and doomed to that fate. But no, it has to be her to lead everyone to face off this time. So she rallies the troops and everyone together, and they all agree, where it turns out that Dopey can actually speak.
We're not afraid.
Yep, the one trait that made Dopey Dopey is now gone because of the fact he has the courage to stand up to speak for himself and not to be afraid of what others say now, turning out to actually be the narrator of this entire film. And you should probably be upset at this fact too, because the charm of Dopey is the fact that he never spoke and acted very goofy. His animation did all the expressions of how he felt, and it made him unique compared to all the other dwarfs who spoke with their names and how they actually took that trait away at the end because they just need to stand up to the queen for what's right, and that's actually not right. It's not right to do for something that has been built up as the antithesis of this very character, and why I rallied to not see this film in theaters because of the sheer disrespect that the dwarves were going to get and have it in all the ways possible.
We had a lot of trouble with the dwarfs. You see, I had to use different artists because there's so much work to be done. There had to be quite a group of artists all working on the dwarfs. And I had quite a time with some of it, but trying to keep the personality there, to keep the dwarf kind of believable, you know. And I set the personalities. I wanted to, no doubt about the personality, so I sort of picked a name to fit the personality. So when I had bashful, he was bashful. I had happy, he was happy. I had dopey, he was dopey. But I said, well, it's the best thing I can think of for somebody that's just a little lost, you see? He was a little touched in the head. He couldn't talk. And as we had Happy explain, he said, well, he just never tried. And then I had Grumpy because he was grumpy. And I had Doc. We had Doc because that sounded officious. He was sort of the leader. The name was the personality. I got voices for everybody, but we couldn't find a voice for Dopey. So we said, well, let's let him be mute, you know? We just won't give him a voice. That'll make him different. And it worked.
Anyway, she finally faces the queen, who tries to tempt her to just kill her as is to reclaim the kingdom to be the murderer that people could see, but can't because of her kind nature that her parents taught her before using the guard's previous life to turn against all that she did and save the kingdom against her, the queen. I'm speeding through this part because it's mostly useless shit in the worst battle that I have ever seen, where the queen eventually dies because she shattered the mirror for telling the truth of why Snow White was valued to be the fairest, because beauty actually comes from within. And no, just no, that's not actually how she died. She died simply just falling off a cliff as an old hag because that's what she deserved to be killed by. Her own hubris and selfish desire that was never true because it actually showed her true beauty from within manifested in her ugliness that fell over with. Not being trapped by a mirror dimension because she's so stupid and tried to break the mirror that restores itself just because. But alas, the movie finally ends in the present with Dopey finishing the book, being kind and fair, and how everyone is dressed in white because, you know, Snow White. And everyone dances to that same tune where all the good things grow. Where the only good thing that actually grew out of this damn film was the end credits as an homage to the storybook text like the original, compared to everything else that failed poorly to match the charm of what it was all about. So while it's not actually the worst Disney live action remake now that I've seen it, it still certainly is the most bland, adding in too much of nothing to the original story that never needed more. One that happens to bleed over into the real world with how people perceive past and present, and the divide of what we have over of what is wrong and what is right, where this video should only be focused on celebrating what it really means, to prove that stuff like this are not the correct course of action, but in a way that shows that there still can be better than this for the sake of the human spirit. Because the original is a timeless masterpiece, the achievement of what can be possible when it was thought not to be, a simple story of love and goodness triumphing over evil and the true spirit of connection to our fellow man, to realize that life has such beauty that is good for all to see and achieve when it comes down to it, that the fairy tale can be real as anything else, which inspired generation after generation to dream and create art as we know it today, where it is my important belief that life can change around from despair to hopefulness, not in the way that they try to teach you here, but in the beauty of simplicity, showing us the way towards it. However we feel about stories old or new, they are all here to stay for all time, so we can guide ourselves for the right light when our time eventually comes, the pathway that is best for why we endure as humanity and for all life that exists or is yet to exist. So I'm all done, where I hope one day we will all have a happily ever after.
Snow White has been out 3 times, I think, and it'll come out many times again. I've got quite a few pictures like that I think are timeless. Hollywood has never been able to figure us out. It's funny, we do pictures, they look at them and they say, well, you know, in a kind of a disparaging way, this is well, this is wonderful for the kids. And I say, well, what's wrong with anything that's wonderful for the kids?